The last frost had finally broken, and I had been waiting on this trip since the first cold snap back in October. I needed the trail the way some people need sleep. My name is Cade, and I have been backpacking these woods since I was old enough to carry a pack without falling over. I know every ridgeline and every creek crossing within 30 miles of where I grew up, and I know which caves stay dry when the weather turns. Rook was already at the door before I had my boots laced. He is a German shepherd, and he has been my trail partner for 6 years. He knows what the pack coming out of the closet means, and he does not let me forget it once he figures out we are going. We left before first light on a Thursday morning with a full pack and 2 days of trail ahead of us. I carried everything I needed to stay out for a week if I wanted to. That is just how I pack. My bow was strapped to the left side of the frame, and my fishing rod was broken down and lashed below it. I had my water filtration kit and my fire starting tools and my basic medical supplies, and enough food to get started before the land could begin feeding me to rest. Rook carried his own small saddlebag with his food and a collapsible bowl and a spare leash I never actually use. He has never once complained about carrying his share. The woods were just starting to wake up after the winter. The ground was soft under boot, and the creek we crossed at mile 3 was running high and fast with snowmelt coming off the ridge. There was no green on the trees yet, but you could feel it building underneath everything. That particular stretch of forest sits up against a long limestone ridge, and the elevation changes fast once you clear the second creek crossing. I have always liked that section of trail because the sound of the outside world disappears within the first mile. No road noise carrying through the trees. No distant hum of traffic or machinery. Just moving water and wind through bare branches. And whatever Rook decides is worth investigating along the way. We pushed hard through morning and stopped to eat at a flat rock above the first ridge where the valley opens up below you. I sat and drank hot coffee from my thermos and watched Rook work the rocks and scrub around us with his nose going constantly. He found something behind a boulder and spent a solid 4 minutes deciding what to do about it before walking away unimpressed. I did not ask what it was. The afternoon was the kind of hiking that clears your head without demanding anything back from you. Long, steady miles on familiar ground with nothing more pressing than where to put your next step. I had a lot carrying around in my head before this trip. Not anything dramatic or specific, just the accumulated weight of too much time inside and too many days that all look the same. The woods handle that better than anything else I have found. The problems that feel large at a desk shrink down to their real size when you are moving through terrain and making small, constant decisions, and watching a dog work a hillside like it is the only thing that matters in the world. I built my way of thinking out here on these trails long before I had a name for it. The prepper label came later. The mindset came from years of being in places where getting it wrong had real consequences. I started storing supplies and learning field skills because they made logical sense to me. Filtering water from sources you cannot trust. Starting fires in conditions that do not cooperate. Reading weather through what the sky and wind are telling you before any system arrives. Processing an animal in the field. Navigating without electronics when the batteries die or the signal drops. None of it started as preparation for anything specific. It started as competence. It started as a satisfaction of knowing that if everything else fell away, I would still be able to function. That mindset shapes how I pack and how I move, and how I read any situation I walk into. It also shapes how I relate to Rook. He is not a companion animal, in the way that phrase usually gets used. He is a working partner. He covers ground I cannot cover with my senses. He reads things in the air and in the soil and in the behavior of other animals that I would walk right past. 6 years on the trail together has built a shorthand between us that does not need words. The way he carries his head tells me if something ahead is worth paying attention to. The way he positions himself relative to me on a trail tells me what his nose is picking up and from which direction. I trust his read on a situation faster than I trust my own instincts because his instincts have been right more often. We made good time through the afternoon, and the light was still workable when I turned us toward the spot I had in mind for the night. A cave entrance set into the limestone face about 40 feet above the valley floor. I had used it twice before on different trips, and it had served well both times. The opening is wide enough to walk into standing straight, and the passage inside bends back to the left and then levels out into a dry, flat section with enough room for a full sleeping setup and a small fire. The curve of the passage keeps fire smoke from pooling at the entrance, and the depth keeps wind from reaching the back section, regardless of what the weather does outside. We reached it with a good hour of light remaining. I gathered deadfall from around the base of the ridge and built a small fire in the back section, while Rook systematically checked every corner and recess of the cave the way he always does when we use a space for the first time. He came back after several minutes and settled beside my pack, which told me he had found nothing worth reporting. I cooked over the fire and fed Rook his meal and sat back against a rock wall and let the day finish itself. The sky outside the entrance had gone fully dark by the time I finished eating, and the stars were dense and hard away they only get when you are far enough from any artificial light that the sky can show you its full depth. There's a specific feeling that comes on the first real warm night after a long cold season. The woods are not fully awake yet, but they're no longer holding their breath either. Something is preparing in the soil and in the trees and in the air above them. I sat with that feeling and did not try to analyze it. Eventually, I spread my sleeping bag out and got Rook settled in against my side, and the fire burned itself down to a low orange glow, and I went to sleep without any trouble. I do not know what time it was when my eyes came open. The light reaching around the curve of the passage was not dawn. The color was wrong for dawn, and the intensity was wrong for any natural light source I had ever seen come through that entrance. It was white and hard and completely sustained without any flicker or variation, and it was throwing clear, sharp shadows off the back wall of the cave from objects that had never cast shadows in there before. I was standing before my brain had fully registered that I was awake. Rook was already on his feet with his body squared toward the passage and his hackles raised in a full ridge from his neck to the base of his tail. The sound he was making was low and steady and came from somewhere deep in him that 6 years of trail time had never called up before. It was not a warning bark. It was something that predated barking by a long stretch of evolution. The shockwave reached us 4 seconds after the light. The limestone flexed, and I went into the wall with my shoulder, and a curtain of fine debris dropped from the ceiling, and the sound that arrived with the shockwave had no frame of reference in anything I had heard before. It was not thunder. It was not an explosion in any sense I had a word for. It was a concussive pressure that moved through the rock itself and kept building and rolling and changing frequency for what felt like 2 full minutes before it began to lose force. I grabbed Rook by his harness and pushed us both back against the deepest section of the far wall, and got down low and put my body between him and the passage. He pressed into me and held still. The debris came next. I could hear it impacting the ground outside the entrance. Not rain, not hail, something with mass behind it landing at irregular intervals across a wide area. It went on for a long time, and I sat in the dark with my hand on Rook and ran through everything I had ever read about what produces that sequence of events. The sustained light, the delayed shockwave, the debris fall coming after. My mind kept arriving at the same conclusion, and I kept setting it aside because I needed to stay functional, and sitting in the dark, deciding the world had ended was not going to help either of us. The debris thinned slowly and eventually stopped, and the silence that moved in behind it had a quality I had never encountered before. Not quiet, not calm, a silence with actual weight and texture. Rook lifted his head once, and his ears tracked something I could not hear, and then he put his chin back down on my leg. I did not sleep again. I sat in that dark with my back against limestone and my hand on my dog, and I waited for the gray light that would eventually find its way around the curve of the passage and tell me that morning had come and that I was going to have to stand up and walk out into whatever was left of the world outside that cave. At some point in that long, dark wait, I went through my pack by feel and confirmed everything was where it needed to be. The bow was undamaged. The fishing rod case was intact. My fire kit was dry. My filtration bottle was clipped to the side pocket where it always lives. I did not do this because I was panicking. I did it because taking inventory is what you do when the situation changes, and the situation had changed in a way that made every item in that pack suddenly more important than it had been 8 hours ago. Knowing what you have is the first step in figuring out what you can do. I have always believed that the difference between someone who survives a bad situation and someone who does not usually comes down to what they do in the first hour after things go wrong. Panic burns time and energy and produces nothing. Assessment produces a plan. A plan produces action. Action is the only thing that has ever gotten anyone through anything. I sat in that cave and I assessed, and I made the beginning of a plan, and I waited for the light that would let me execute it. Rook slept for a while somewhere in the middle of that wait, which told me the immediate danger had passed enough for his instincts to allow rest. That mattered to me. He does not sleep through threats. When he finally put his head down and his breathing slowed, I let myself relax a degree and just waited in the dark with the fire long dead and the silence sitting over everything outside like a hell breath that the world was not ready to release. The gray light came slowly, and I gave it time before I moved toward the passage. Rook was already up and standing near the curve of the rock, with his nose working the air coming in from outside. He was not alarmed, but he was reading something, and I watched him for a full minute before I moved up beside him. The air had a smell I had no reference for. It was not smoke exactly, though there was char in it. It was heavier than smoke and had a mineral quality underneath it like hot rock, and something else I could not name sitting below that. I moved through the passage with my hand on the wall and came to the entrance and stopped. The world outside that cave was not the world I had walked into the night before. Every tree I could see was stripped and burned to a black skeleton with no bark remaining, and no branches below the top third of the trunk, where a few charred stubs reached out at broken angles. The ground was covered in ash so thick, and even it looked like gray snow that had fallen without wind and settled flat across every surface. Rocks I recognized from the approach to the cave entrance were still in their positions, but coated gray and in some cases cracked from heat stress. The sky was the worst of it. There was no blue. There was no normal cloud cover. The entire sky was a churning dark mass of brown and gray moving in slow, heavy rolls that blocked direct sunlight completely and let through only a flat orange glow along the horizon that made the ash-covered ground look like it was faintly lit from below. I stood at the entrance for a long time and looked at it. Rook came up beside me and sat down and looked at it with me, and neither of us moved for a while. The smell outside was stronger than what had been reaching into the passage. I pulled my buff up over my nose and mouth before stepping out. The ash was deep enough in places to swallow my boot to the ankle, and it puffed up around each step and hung in the still air before settling again. There was no wind, none at all. The complete stillness made the landscape feel frozen, even though the temperature was not cold. It was a flat, dead warmth that had no movement in it. I walked a short distance from the entrance and turned in a slow circle and looked at every direction. The valley below was ash. The ridge above was ash and black rock and burned timber, standing like fence posts across the skyline. The creek I had crossed on the way and was still running. I could hear it below me, and when I worked down to it, the water was moving but dark with suspended ash and debris. It was running, but it was not clean. I noted it as a filterable source and moved on. I needed to see the extent of what had happened, and I needed to get to where my house had been. My property bordered these woods on the eastern side, about 2 miles from where I was standing. I loaded my pack and checked my bow and signaled Rook to heel, and we moved out into the ash. Walking through it was slow and strange. The silence was total, except for the soft compression of ash underfoot with each step. No birds, no insects, no movement in the standing dead timber around us. Rook stayed close and kept his nose up and working, but he was not ranging out the way he normally does on a trail. He stayed within 10 feet of me the entire walk, and that told me more about the landscape we were moving through than my own eyes could. We reached the edge of where the neighborhood had been in just over an hour. I had walked this route from the trailhead dozens of times in both directions. I knew where the first houses started, and I knew what they looked like, and I knew the road that ran between them and the tree line. There was no road visible. There was no structure standing in any direction I looked. The ash was deeper here where it had settled into collapsed remains of buildings and filled the spaces between debris piles that barely reached knee height. A few chimneys were still partially upright. A few pieces of heavy metal framing jutted out of the gray at low angles. Everything else was flat and covered and unrecognizable. I walked to where my house had stood. I knew the position from the tree line behind it and from the slope of the ground and from a large flat rock at the corner of what had been my back property line that was still there under its coating of ash. I stood on that spot and looked at the outline of debris beneath the gray, and there was nothing to do with what I was looking at except understand it and move on. I did not stand there long. There was nothing to recover from the site. Whatever had been inside was gone in any usable sense. What mattered was what was on my back and what was around me and what I could find in the rubble of the surrounding area. I started working the debris field systematically, the way you work any salvage situation. Slow grid pattern. Eyes on the ground. Anything useful gets pulled and staged. I found metal roofing panels that had warped but were still intact enough to be useful as windbreak material. I found lengths of heavy wire coiled in what had been a garage. I found tools scattered from a collapsed shed, including a full-size axe with a cracked handle that could be repaired and a handsaw that was intact. I found a propane camp stove still in its case inside a melted storage bin with 2 canisters that felt full when I shook them. I found a nylon tarp folded inside a metal storage box that had shielded it from the worst of the heat. The tarp had some scorching on one corner, but was functional. I staged everything I found in a central pile, and then made decisions about what I could carry on a first trip and what I would need to come back for. Rook moved through the debris field with me, and twice he stopped and indicated with his posture that something below the ash was worth my attention. Both times he was right. A sealed plastic storage bin with basic medical supplies still intact inside, and a metal ammunition can with a waterproof seal that contained fire-starting materials I could use. I loaded what I could carry on top of my existing pack and picked up what I could carry by hand, and we started back toward the cave. The walk back felt different from the walk out. On the way out, I had still been processing what I was seeing. On the way back, I had a destination and a task and a first load of materials, and that changed the weight of everything. The cave was shelter. The debris field was a supply source. The river was water. My pack was a foundation. That was a situation, and those were the resources, and from that point forward, everything I did would be about turning those 4 things into something sustainable. I got back to the cave with the first load and staged everything inside near the entrance where I could sort it properly. Rook drank from his collapsible bowl, and I filtered water from my bottle and drank and sat for a few minutes on the rock outside the entrance, looking out at the ash field below the ridge. The sky had not changed since morning. The same heavy brown roll moving overhead with the same orange tint bleeding along the horizon. I did not know yet how long the sky would look like that. I did not know how far the damage extended or whether it was regional or something larger. What I knew was that the fish in the creek were likely still alive in the deeper pools below the initial shock, and that small ground animals and burrows might have survived, and that I had a bow and a fishing rod and enough skill with both to feed myself and Rook without needing anything from the outside world. I knew the cave was defensible and dry and deep enough to be safe. I knew I had just done the first pass of a debris field that would yield more on subsequent runs. I was not in a good situation, but I was in a workable one, and workable was enough to start with. I spent the rest of that first day making 2 more runs to the debris field and adding to my supply pile inside the cave. On the second run, I found a hand cart with 1 bent wheel that still rolled well enough to carry a load, and that changed my hauling capacity significantly. On the third run, I pushed further into the debris field and found a section of collapsed structure that had been a basement level. The floor above it had dropped in and sealed the space, but the contents had been partially protected from the worst of the heat. I spent an hour working the debris off the access point and got into a space that had shelving along one wall, still holding sealed containers. Canned goods with their labels burned off, but the cans intact. A sealed 5-gallon water container that was full. More tools. A hand-powered hand drill with bits. 2 wool blankets sealed in a storage bag that had melted on the outside, but protected what was inside. I loaded the hand cart and pushed it back to the cave and felt the math of the situation shifting in a direction I could work with. By the time the dim orange light outside began to fade toward whatever passed for dark under that sky, I had a staging area inside the cave entrance with enough raw material to begin building something real. I fed Rook the last of his packaged food and noted that finding a sustainable food source for him was a priority equal to my own. He could eat fish and cooked meat, and I intended to make sure he had both. I built a fire deeper in the cave and cooked a simple meal from my pack supplies and sat in the warmth of it with Rook beside me. The cave smelled of ash and dust and smoke from the fire, but it was shelter and it was mine, and I had already decided it was going to stay that way. The entrance needed a barrier. The air circulation needed a solution. The water situation needed a permanent filtration setup. The food situation needed a hunting and fishing rotation. These were the next problems, and I would address them in order starting at first light. I was not thinking about what had caused any of this. I was not thinking about whether anyone else had survived or what the world looked like beyond what I could see. Those were questions that had no useful answers yet. What had answers were the problems directly in front of me, and I intended to spend every hour of usable light working on them, until I had built something in that cave that could hold. Rook settled in close to the fire, and watched the cave entrance the way he does when he is on a light watch, and I let him take that role without interrupting it. He had earned it, and I trusted his ears more than I trusted the barrier I had not built yet. The first thing I did the next morning was walk the perimeter of the cave entrance and start thinking about the wall. I needed a barrier that would keep anything desperate enough to approach out, while still allowing me to get in and out without tearing down my own work every time. The limestone ridge gave me plenty of raw material. Flat stones were everywhere along the base of the rock face, and I spent the first 2 hours of daylight pulling the best of them and staging them near the entrance. I worked a dry stack method, building the wall in 2 sections with a gap in the center, wide enough to pass through with a loaded pack. For the door, I found heavy gauge metal shelving panels in the debris field on my first run a day and bent, and wired them into a frame that fit the gap and could be secured from the inside with a length of steel rod dropped into brackets. I fixed the wall on either side. It was not pretty, but it did not need to be pretty. It needed to keep something with 4 legs and bad intentions from walking in while I slept, and it would do that. The air problem took more thought. A sealed cave with fire inside will pull carbon monoxide up from combustion and displace breathable air faster than most people realize. I had already been keeping the entrance partially open at night for that reason, but with the wall going up, I needed a real solution. I found it on the 3rd debris run of that day. A small box fan still in its packaging inside a sealed plastic storage tote that had survived under a collapsed section of garage wall. The packaging was heat damaged on the outside, but the fan inside was intact. On the same run, I found a length of flexible aluminum dryer duct coiled on a hook in the same garage debris. I carried both back to the cave and spent an hour working out the installation. I ran the duct through a gap I left in the upper section of the stone wall and angled it, so the fan sitting just inside drew fresh air in from outside, while stale interior air pushed out through a second smaller gap on the opposite side of the doorframe. I used wire and packed stone to seal around the duct where it passed through the wall, so the airflow was directed rather than leaking through random gaps. I fired up the salvage propane camp stove to test the setup, and the air movement was immediate and consistent. The cave could now be fully sealed at night and still breathe. That solved the problem I had been most concerned about. With the shelter structure addressed, I turned full attention to food. I had been running on packed supplies since the event, and those had a hard limit. The creek below the ridge was my first target. I broke out my fishing rod and rigged it with a small spinner from my tackle kit and worked down to the water through the ash field. The creek was still running dark, but the flow had cleared slightly since the first morning. I found a deep pool below a shelf of rock where the current slowed and dropped my line in and had a strike within 4 minutes. The fish that came up was a brown trout of maybe 12 inches. Not large, but real and alive and proof that the water held more. I worked that pool for an hour and pulled out 4 fish total. I cleaned them at the water and packed them back to the cave and cooked 3 over the fire that evening. I set one aside whole. I had an idea about that one that I was not ready to act on yet, but I kept it back anyway. Hunting took longer to produce results. I took the bout on the second morning after the wall was finished and worked the ash field and the base of the ridge looking for any sign of animal movement. The ground animals that had survived would still be in their burrows. Rabbits and ground squirrels and anything else that had been underground when the event hit had a real chance of making it through. I found tracks in the ash near a dense section of collapsed brush. Small and close set. Rabbit. I set a wire snare and checked it the following morning and found it had been triggered, but the animal had pulled free. I reset it with a tighter loop, and the morning after that I had a rabbit. It was thin, but it was meat, and I processed it to snare site and added it to the cooking rotation. Rook got a full portion and ate without ceremony the way he always does. The debris runs continued every day, and each one added something useful to the cave inventory. I found a second axe head without a handle that I fitted to a straight length of hardwood salvage from a collapsed fence post. I found a cast iron skillet buried under ash near what had been a back porch that cleaned up and went straight onto the cooking setup. I found 3 sealed mason jars of preserved food in a root cellar space I discovered by stepping through weakened ground on a run to the eastern edge of the debris field. The root cellar had partially collapsed, but the far corner had held, and the shelving along that wall still had items on it. I spent 2 hours carefully clearing the debris above it and got into the space and came out with the jars and a sealed metal tin of coffee and a hand crank can opener still in its packaging. Small things, but each small thing added margin, and margin is what keeps you alive when the situation stays hard for longer than expected. I also found on that same run a hand crank emergency radio sealed in a waterproof case inside a hall closet that had collapsed inward and trapped the contents instead of crushing them. I brought it back and cranked it for 10 minutes and worked through every frequency I could reach. Static on everything. Not a signal on any band. I set it aside and kept it charged in rotation, because no signal now did not mean no signal later. The cave was taking real shape around all of this daily work. I had the salvage wool blanket spread over a sleeping platform I built from lumber laid across stacked stone to get me up off the cold cave floor. My pack and all salvage supplies were organized along the right wall, within arm reach of where I slept. I had a cooking area positioned near the air intake side of the cave, so smoke pulled toward the duct and out rather than collecting at the ceiling above me. The water filtration setup ran continuously, and Filter Creek water filled a sealed 5-gallon container I kept topped off on every run to the creek. I had run power to the fan from a small battery bank I found in the debris field that still held a partial charge, and I rationed its use to nighttime hours when the wall was sealed and the fire was burning. The battery would not last indefinitely, and I was already thinking about what came after it ran out. A hand crank solution, or a way to wire the fan to something that generated its own power. I had not found the right components yet, but I had not stopped looking on any run. Every debris pass was also a scouting pass for the next problem before it had time to become a crisis. You do not wait for a problem to arrive fully formed and demand your attention. You see it coming from 3 days out, and you start working the solution before the urgency hits. Rook had settled fully into the rhythm of the cave by the end of that first week. He knew the morning routine and the debris run routine and the fishing routine. He worked the ash field on every outing with his nose, and twice that week he located buried material I would have walked past without him. A coil of paracord under 8 inches of ash that his nose found before my eyes did. A sealed bag with fire tinder inside that had been blown from somewhere and half buried against a rock. He was earning his keep on every single outing, and I made sure he knew I noticed. I talked to him on the trail the way I always have. Not because I thought he parsed every word, but because it kept my own thinking ordered, and he responded to tone and cadence in a way that made the exchange feel real enough to matter. By the end of what I estimated was the 7th day since the event, I had shelter and food and water and a functioning system for maintaining all three. Rook was eating consistently and moving well and sleeping soundly at night. And that last detail continued to be the most reliable indicator I had that the immediate area was stable. A dog who sleeps through the night in a new environment is a dog who has decided the environment is acceptable, and I trusted that read completely. The isolation was present the same way the ash was present. It was a condition of the situation, and conditions are what you work within, not what you stop to grieve. Every hour of usable daylight had a task attached to it, and that structure left no room for anything that did not move the situation forward. The wall held. The air moved clean through the duct. The fire stayed controlled and fed. The food kept coming in from the creek and the snare line. 1 week into the end of everything, and I was still upright, and Rook was still beside me, and that was the only number on the board that mattered at the close of any given day. On the 8th day, I pushed further south along the creek than I had gone before looking for a better fishing pool, and found something I had not expected. The creek widened into a shallow basin about a quarter-mile below my usual spot, and the water there was clearer than anything I had seen since the event. The ash had not settled as heavily in that section, because the rock walls on either side channeled the flow fast enough to keep the surface moving. The pool below the basin was deep and cold, and when I dropped my line in, I had 3 strikes in under 10 minutes. Larger fish than I had been pulling from the upper pool. I marked the location carefully in my head, and made note of the terrain features around it, so I could find it again without having to work the whole creek bank each time. On the way back, I checked my snare line, and had 2 rabbits waiting. I processed them both on site, and carried everything back to the cave, and spent the afternoon smoking the meat over a low fire to extend how long it would keep. Smoking meat without a proper setup requires patience, but the basic method is straightforward. Slow heat and consistent smoke, and enough time to pull the moisture out. I used green wood from a section of root system I had dug up near the base of the ridge that had survived underground. The smoke had a clean smell that reminded me of something from before the event, and I let that thought pass without following it anywhere. The cave smelled like wood smoke and fish and the mineral coal of the rock, and that combination had already started to feel like something close to normal. I ate well that night, and Rook ate well, and we sat by the low fire until the coals dropped and the fan pushed the last of the smoke out and the cave went quiet. 8 days in, shelter holding, food rotating, water clean. The situation was workable and getting more workable by the day. I found the tracks on the 9th day during a debris run that took me further west than I had gone before. The ash out that direction was deeper because the terrain flattened and there was nothing to channel the wind that had moved debris around in the days after the event. I was working along the edge of what had been a tree line when I saw them. Large canine prints pressed into the ash at a walking pace, moving north along the base of a low rock shelf. I stopped and crouched over them and looked at the size and the spacing and the depth. Too large for a domestic dog. The stride was long, and the print was broad across the toe pads with a rear claw impression that sat further back than any dog I had worked with. Wolf. I looked at Rook, and he was already facing north with his nose up and his ears forward. He was not alarmed, but he was locked in on something, and I trusted that read. I followed the tracks slowly with Rook at a close heel. The prints moved along the rock shelf for about 200 yards before turning into a narrow gap between two large boulders that sat against the base of the ridge. I stopped at the gap and did not go in. I could hear something on the other side of the rock, a low sound, faint and intermittent. I worked around the outside of the boulder formation until I found an angle where I could see into the space beyond without entering it. The den was set back under an overhang of rock, where the base of the ridge curved inward and created a shallow shelter, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet high at the entrance. She was lying at the back of it with 3 pups pressed against her side. The pups were small, young enough that they were still in the stage where they piled against each other for warmth more than they moved independently. She had seen me before I saw her. Her eyes were on me, and they did not move, and she did not move, and the sound she was making was below the threshold of a growl, but it was there. I did not move either. I held my position and kept my body language slow and low, and let her read me for a full minute before I took 1 step back, and then another, and then turned and walked away at a steady pace. Rook stayed at my heel without being asked. He had read the situation the same way I had. I thought about what I had seen on the walk back to the cave. She was alive and the pups were alive, but she was lean in a way that told me she was burning more than she was taking in. The landscape had nothing for her right now. The small ground animals that were starting to come back were not enough to sustain a nursing wolf and 3 pups. She would have to range further and further from the den to find food, and ranging far from young pups in an unstable environment was a losing equation. I thought about the fish I had set aside 3 days earlier and then given to Rook when I could not think of a good reason to keep holding it back. I had a reason now. The next morning, I pulled 2 fish from the lower pool and cleaned them and carried them on the way back from the creek. I approached the boulder formation from the same angle as the day before and stopped about 30 feet from the gap in the rocks. I set both fish down on a flat section of rock where she would be able to smell them from inside the den, and then I walked away without looking back. I did not know if she would take them. I did not know if the smell of me on them would be enough to make her leave them alone. What I knew was that she was surviving on nothing in a landscape that had almost nothing to offer, and that I had more fish than I needed from a pool that was giving consistently. The math was simple enough. I came back the following morning, and the fish were gone. The flat rock was clean, and there were fresh prints in the ash around it. One set of large adult prints approaching and retreating. She had come alone and taken them and gone back. I left 2 more and came back the next day, and those were gone too. On the 3rd day, I approached a little closer before setting the fish down, 20 feet instead of 30. She appeared at the gap in the boulders while I was still standing there. She did not come through the gap. She stood just inside it with her body half visible and watched me set the fish on the rock and step back. We looked at each other for about 10 seconds, and then I turned and walked away. I did not make it a moment longer than it needed to be. Trust between a wild animal and a person is built in the smallest possible increments, and the fastest way to destroy it is to push past the boundary the animal has set. She had shown herself. That was enough for that day. Rook was complicated by all of this in a way I had to manage carefully. He knew the wolves were there from the first day I found the tracks. His nose had been telling him about them before I ever saw a print. He did not react aggressively, but he was alert every time we moved in that direction, and I kept him on a close heel during every approach to the den. He accepted that direction without pushing against it, which told me he understood the situation well enough. He is not a dog who needs to challenge everything. He reads context and he adjusts, and that quality had always made him easy to work with in new situations. Over the following days, a pattern developed that held itself steady. I brought fish every morning on my way back from the lower pool. I set them on the flat rock and stepped back. She began appearing at the gap more consistently as the days passed, not coming out, but visible, watching. On the 12th day, she came through the gap fully and stood in the open while I set the fish down. She was thin across the hips, but she was holding together, and the pups behind her in the den were louder than they had been on the first day, which told me they were growing. I set the fish down and stepped back the usual distance, and she walked to the rock and took the first fish without breaking eye contact with me. She ate standing up with her eyes moving between the fish and me in a rotation that never fully relaxed. I stood still and kept my breathing even and did not speak. When she finished the first fish, she took the second one back toward the den and disappeared through the gap. I waited a moment and then turned and walked back toward the cave. I ran through the practical side of it on the walk. Feeding her was sustainable as long as the lower pool kept producing and the snare line kept turning over. She was not a threat to me as long as I respected the terms she had set and did not close the distance faster than she allowed. The pups would grow and eventually begin hunting with her, and at some point she would not need the fish anymore. Until then, I had enough to share, and sharing cost me nothing I could not replace. There was also a practical benefit I had not fully calculated at the start. A wolf ranging the area around my cave was a deterrent to anything else that might be moving through the landscape. Whatever had survived the event and was desperate enough to approach a human camp would think twice about territory that smelled like an active wolf den. That was not why I started leaving the fish, but it was a real return on the investment, and I noted it without feeling like I needed to justify the arrangement any further than that. By the end of the second week, she was coming to the flat rock before I had fully stepped back from setting the fish down. Not close enough to touch. Not close enough for anything that could be called comfortable by any normal measure, but present in a way that was different from the first day. She had decided I was not a threat worth the energy of avoiding, and that was as much as I needed from her. I watched her eat on the 14th evening, and noted that her hip bones were less visible than they had been on the first day I saw her. She was holding weight. The pups were audible from outside the den now. When they were active, that sound carried across the ash field, and it was the closest thing to normal I had heard since the night the world came apart. I kept the fish rotation consistent and never missed a morning drop at the flat rock, because consistency was the thing that built the understanding between us. Wild animals do not extend trust to unpredictable sources. She needed to know that when I appeared at that boulder formation in the morning, there would be food on that rock, and I would step back and stay back. That reliability was the only language that mattered in the arrangement. I also started paying attention to where she ranged when she left the den. On 2 occasions, I saw her moving along the far western edge of the ash field in the early morning light before I had fully left the cave. She was hunting, working the ground in long, sweeping passes with her nose down the way a hunting wolf moves when it is covering distance rather than tracking a specific target. She was supplementing what I brought with whatever the landscape was starting to give back. That was good. The longer the landscape could support her on its own, the less dependent the arrangement was on my fish supply, and a wolf that could feed itself was a wolf that could keep those pups alive without needing anything from me. The pups appeared outside the den for the first time on the 15th day. 2 of them came through the gap while I was setting the fish on the rock and stood blinking in the flat gray light with their legs wide and uncertain. She was at the rock already, and she looked at them and then at me and held her position. I did not move. I did not make a sound. The 2 pups stood at the gap for about 30 seconds before something startled them and they scrambled back inside. The mother held eye contact with me through all of it, and when they were back inside, she looked back at the fish and finished eating. The 3rd pup did not come out that day, but the next morning all 3 appeared at the gap together while she ate. They were bigger than they had looked through the crack in the boulders on the first day, growing fast the way wolf pups do in those early weeks. I watched them from my step-back position and kept everything in my body language slow and unremarkable, and they watched me back with the wide, unfocused curiosity of animals who had not yet learned what category I belonged in. That was fine by me. I just needed the arrangement to hold. Rook sat beside me on that morning and watched the pups with his body still and quiet beside me. I had brought extra fish without consciously deciding to. I set the usual amount on the flat rock, and on a second flat stone nearby, I set 2 smaller pieces. I was not trying to push the arrangement past what it had become on its own terms. I was just leaving the door open a crack. Somewhere around the 3rd week, I started pushing my scavenging runs further out than I had gone before. The immediate debris field around the old neighborhood had given up most of what it was going to give, and the useful material that remained was buried deep enough that extracting it required more time than the return justified. I needed to expand the search radius, and that meant longer days and more ground covered and a higher level of attention to what Rook was telling me on the way out and the way back. The landscape at the 2-mile mark looked different from what was directly around the cave. The terrain had channeled the blast effects differently out there, and there were sections where standing structures had partially survived, not intact. Nothing was intact, but walls that were still at shoulder height, and roof sections that had dropped inward rather than outward, and spaces underneath the collapse that had been partially shielded from the worst of the heat. I worked those sections carefully. Collapsed structures are unstable, and the ash covering everything meant you could not always tell what was solid ground and what was a void waiting to drop you through into whatever was below. I used a long piece of rebar I had been carrying as a probe since the 2nd week. Tap the ground ahead before you put weight on it. If it sounds hollow, you find another way around. Rook had learned to read my probing and would stop and wait when I started working the rebar ahead of me. He never rushed me through a questionable section, and I had stopped being surprised by how much he understood about the work we were doing together. On the first long run, I found a partially standing structure that had been a small commercial building of some kind on the edge of what used to be the main road through the area. The front half was gone, but the back section had a cinder block wall still standing to roof height, and the interior space behind it was accessible through a collapsed section on the south side. I worked through the gap and found a storage room that had been sealed by a metal fire door that had warped in the heat but held its frame. I spent 20 minutes working the door with a pry bar I carried and got it open and found shelving along 3 walls still holding inventory. Industrial quantities of canned food, sealed buckets that turned out to be dry goods, cases of bottled water that had partially melted on the outside of the plastic, but the bottles themselves were intact and the water inside was fine. I stood in that storage room for a moment and ran the math on what I was looking at. It was more food than I could carry in a week of runs with the hand cart. I took what I could move on the first trip and marked the location in my memory with 3 fixed terrain references and got back to the cave before the light dropped. I made 4 more runs to that storage room over the following days, and each time I came back with a loaded cart. The cave supply wall went from functional to something closer to a real stockpile. I had enough dry goods and canned food to sustain myself and Rook for months without needing to hunt or fish at all, though I intended to keep both going regardless, because a single supply source is a single point of failure, and I had never been comfortable with single points of failure. It was on the fourth run to the storage room that I found the tracks. I had taken a slightly different approach route to avoid a section of ground that had been soft on the previous run, and the new line took me along the edge of an ash-covered parking area that I had not crossed before. Rook slowed first. His head came up and his pace dropped, and he angled slightly left without being directed. I stopped and looked at what he was reading, and saw the impressions in the ash about 10 feet to my left. Boot prints, adult size, a single set moving from east to west at a walking pace with a fairly long stride that suggested someone of average height moving without urgency. I crouched over them and looked at the tread pattern pressed into the ash. Lug sole, work boot or hiking boot. The edges of the prints were slightly degraded, which put them at somewhere between 1 and 3 days old, depending on whether any wind had moved through after they were made. I followed them with my eyes to where they disappeared around the corner of a collapsed wall to the west. I did not follow them with my feet. I stood up and looked in the direction they had come from to the east, and then in the direction they were heading to the west, and I noted both without moving toward either. Someone had walked through this area recently, moving with purpose based on the stride pattern, not wandering, going somewhere specific, or at least moving in a chosen direction. I looked at Rook, and he was still reading the air to the west with his ears forward and his body angled that direction. Whatever scent was attached to those prints was still present enough for him to work it. I let him read for another minute, and then signaled him back to heel, and we finished the run to the storage room and loaded the cart and came home the way we had come. I passed the boot prints again on the return and stopped and looked at them one more time without touching them. I did not call out. The thought crossed my mind, and I let it pass. If someone was moving through the area, they were doing it quietly and deliberately, and announcing myself to an unknown person in an unstable landscape was not a decision I was ready to make on the basis of a set of boot prints in the ash. I filed it and kept moving. Back at the cave, I stored the supplies and fed Rook and sat with it while I ate. The boot prints meant at least one person had survived within a reasonable distance of my position. They could be sheltering somewhere nearby, or they could have been passing through from a distance. The direction they were heading was toward a section of the old town center, about a mile further west, which had a higher concentration of commercial buildings and basements, and a kind of structural density that gave people places to shelter underground. If someone had been in a basement when the event hit, they had a real chance of surviving the initial blast and the debris fall, coming out into the same landscape I had come out into and making the same kinds of decisions I had made. I did not go looking for them the next day or the day after. I kept my routine and my radius, and I watched the ground more carefully on every run for any additional sign. 3 days after finding the first set of prints, I found a second set in a different location further north. Different tread pattern, smaller foot, moving south. These were fresher. The edges were sharp, and the ash had not settled back into the impressions at all, which put them at under 12 hours old. 2 different people moving through the area on different days in different directions. I noted it and kept it filed. The sky had been changing slowly for several days by this point. The heavy brown roll that had been sitting over everything since the first morning was breaking apart in sections. Not clearing, not blue sky by any measure, but the density was dropping, and there were moments during the day when the light coming through was closer to white than the flat orange it had been since the event. On the evening of what I estimated was a 22nd day, I was sitting at the cave entrance after feeding the wolf and watching the western horizon when I saw the first direct light I had seen since before the event. A single shaft of something closer to actual sunlight breaking through a gap in the debris layer for about 40 seconds before the cloud shifted and closed it off again. It was not much, but it was different from every other evening since the world had changed, and different in the right direction was enough to note without needing to make anything more of it than what it was. I cranked the emergency radio that night and worked through the band slowly, and on one mid-range frequency, I caught something that was not static, a broken signal that lasted maybe 4 seconds before dropping back into noise. Not clear enough to confirm as a voice, but it had a rhythm that static does not have. Something was transmitting somewhere on that band. Too far or too weak to reach me clearly, but present enough to register. I left it set to that frequency and kept it charged from that point forward. The supply situation by the end of the 3rd week was better than I had any right to expect. The commercial storage room had given up most of what it had, and my cave wall was stocked with enough food to sustain 2 people for an extended period. The water system was running clean, and the filtration setup had been performing without issue since I installed it. The fan and duct were moving air consistently, and I had found a hand crank backup for the fan on a debris run earlier that week, which solved the battery dependency problem I had been working around since the start. My snare line was running at 2 to 3 rabbits per week, and the lower fishing pool was giving me 4 to 6 fish on a good morning. I was eating better than the situation had any obligation to allow, and Rook was carrying weight he had not been carrying on the trail before the event. The wolf pups were coming to the edge of the flat rock area now when their mother ate, not taking food directly, just present, watching the exchange of the focused attention of young animals, learning what the world contains and how the adults in it behave. The mother tolerated their presence at the edge of the exchange without calling them back, which I took as its own kind of signal about how she read the arrangement at this point. I did not extend my hand toward them. I did not try to close any distance that she had not already closed on her own terms. I just kept the fish coming and kept my movements slow and consistent, and let the situation develop at whatever pace it chose. Somewhere around the 3rd week, I started pushing my scavenging runs further out than I had gone before. The immediate debris field around the old neighborhood had given up most of what it was going to give, and the useful material that remained was buried deep enough that extracting it required more time than the return justified. I needed to expand the search radius, and that meant longer days and more ground covered and a higher level of attention to what Rook was telling me on the way out and the way back. The landscape at the 2-mile mark looked different from what was directly around the cave. The terrain had channeled the blast effects differently out there, and there were sections where standing structures had partially survived. Not intact. Nothing was intact, but walls that were still at shoulder height, and roof sections that had dropped inward rather than outward, and spaces underneath the collapse that had been partially shielded from the worst of the heat. I worked those sections carefully. Collapsed structures are unstable, and the ash covering everything meant you could not always tell what was solid ground and what was a void waiting to drop you through into whatever was below. I used a long piece of rebar I had been carrying as a probe since the 2nd week. Tap the ground ahead before you put weight on it. If it sounds hollow, you find another way around. Rook had learned to read my probing and would stop and wait when I started working the rebar ahead of me. He never rushed me through a questionable section, and I had stopped being surprised by how much he understood about the work we were doing together. On the first long run, I found a partially standing structure that had been a small commercial building of some kind on the edge of what used to be the main road through the area. The front half was gone, but the back section had a cinder block wall still standing to roof height, and the interior space behind it was accessible through a collapsed section on the south side. I worked through the gap and found a storage room that had been sealed by a metal fire door that had warped in the heat but held its frame. I spent 20 minutes working the door with a pry bar I carried and got it open and found shelving along 3 walls still holding inventory. Industrial quantities of canned food, sealed buckets that turned out to be dry goods, cases of bottled water that had partially melted on the outside of plastic, but the bottles themselves were intact and the water inside was fine. I stood in that storage room for a moment and ran the math on what I was looking at. It was more food than I could carry in a week of runs with the hand cart. I took what I could move on the first trip and marked the location in my memory with 3 fixed terrain references and got back to the cave before the light dropped. I made 4 more runs to that storage room over the following days, and each time I came back with a loaded cart. The cave supply wall went from functional to something closer to a real stockpile. I had enough dry goods and canned food to sustain myself and Rook for months without needing to hunt or fish at all, though I intended to keep both going regardless, because a single supply source is a single point of failure, and I had never been comfortable with single points of failure. It was on the 4th run to the storage room that I found the tracks. I had taken a slightly different approach route to avoid a section of ground that had been soft on the previous run, and the new line took me along the edge of an ash-covered parking area that I had not crossed before. Rook slowed first. His head came up and his pace dropped, and he angled slightly left without being directed. I stopped and looked at what he was reading and saw the impressions in the ash about 10 feet to my left. Boot prints, adult-sized, a single set moving from east to west at a walking pace with a fairly long stride that suggested someone of average height, moving without urgency. I crouched over them and looked at the tread pattern pressed into the ash. Lug sole, work boot or hiking boot. The edges of the prints were slightly degraded, which put them at somewhere between 1 and 3 days old, depending on whether any wind had moved through after they were made. I followed them with my eyes to where they disappeared around the corner of a collapsed wall to the west. I did not follow them with my feet. I stood there and looked in both directions along the line the prints were traveling, and noted the bearing without moving toward either end of it. Then I turned around and finished the run to the storage room and loaded the cart and came back to the cave. I filed the boot prints the same way I filed every piece of information that had no immediate actionable use. It went into the back of my thinking and stayed there without pulling my attention away from the work in front of me. The sky that evening held more color along the western horizon than it had since the event. Not full sunset color, but something closer to it than the flat, dead glow that had been all the sky offered for the first 2 weeks. Layers moving through the debris layer in shades that had no business being there yet and were there anyway. I sat at the cave entrance and watched it until the color faded and the dark settled in, and then I went inside and secured the door and banked a fire and lay down. The wolf pups had been outside the den for most of the afternoon when I passed on my way back. All 3 of them working the flat area around the boulders with the loose, unsteady energy of animals, discovering that the world extended past the gap in the rocks. Their mother watched from the entrance without intervening and watched me pass without moving. I kept my distance and my pace and did not slow down. The arrangement had a shape to it now, and I was not going to disturb that shape. Rook watched the pups from my heel and kept walking. By the end of what I estimated was the 22nd or 23rd day, the cave was running at a level I would not have projected in the first week. The supply wall was stock deep. The water system was clean and consistent. The fan was moving air without issue. The snare line and the lower pool were both producing reliably. Rook was healthy and alert and sleeping soundly every night, and that remained the most reliable indicator I had that the immediate area was stable. I sat with the low fire and looked at the cave walls around me and ran the inventory in my head, and it came back solid every time. The world outside was still broken in every direction I could see from the entrance. But I was not broken, and neither was Rook, and the cave behind us was holding, and that was the whole of it. The 26 days started the same way every day had started since the event. Up before the light reached the entrance. Fire going before Rook had finished his morning stretch. Water heating while I fed him, and 8 standing up running through the check in my head. Wall secure. Fan running. Supplies accounted for. The routine had become physical memory at this point, and that was exactly where I needed it. Automatic systems free up attention for the things that still require active thought, and there were always things that required active thought. I had been keeping a running mental log of what had changed since the first day, and by the end of the 3rd week, The list was longer than I would have predicted sitting in that cave the morning after the event. The creek was running cleaner than it had been in the first week. The ash on the flat ground was compacting under its own weight and becoming more stable underfoot. The rabbit sign on the snare line was increasing steadily, which told me the population in the burrow systems along the ridge was recovering faster than I had estimated. The wolf pups were outside the den every morning now, ranging short distances from the gap on their own while their mother ate at the flat rock. The sky was showing more variation in its daily coverage than it had in the first 2 weeks. Small changes, but all of them moving in the right direction. And direction matters as much as position when you're trying to read how a situation is going to develop. I pushed my scavenging range further on the 26th morning than I had gone before. Northwest this time along a route I had been working toward for several days. The terrain out that direction dropped into a shallow depression before rising again, and the depression had collected deep ash that made the footing unpredictable. I used the rebar probe the whole way through it and came out the other side onto firmer ground that had a different character than the debris field closer to the old neighborhood. Out here, the structures that had stood were more spread out and the collapse patterns were different, less total destruction, and more selective damage depending on how each building had faced the initial blast and how the terrain around it had channeled or blocked the heat. I found a metal outbuilding, standing nearly intact about a mile from cave, a garage or workshop of some kind with a roll-up door that had warped in its tracks but had not opened. I worked the side door with the pry bar and got it open and stood in the entrance letting my eyes adjust. The interior had been protected well enough that the contents were largely intact. Hand tools hanging on a pegboard wall, a workbench with a vise, shelving along the back wall with hardware and supplies organized in labeled bins that had partially melted but still held their contents. I spent 2 hours in that building and came out with a loaded cart, a full socket set in a metal case, lengths of steel rod that would serve for multiple construction uses, rolls of wire in different gauges, a hand-cranked grinding wheel still in its mounting bracket that I unbolted from the workbench and added to the load, a tin of machine oil sealed tight, spare hardware in every size I could find room for. The grinding wheel was the most valuable single item. I had been maintaining my knife and the axe heads by hand on a flat stone, and the results were functional but not what a proper wheel would produce. Sharp edges on your tools are not a comfort item in this kind of situation. They are a safety and efficiency issue, and I have been working around a gap in my setup that this will close completely. I mounted it inside the cave 2 days later on a bracket. I fixed the cave wall near the cooking area and ran both blades across it that same evening, and the difference was immediate. The axe bit into the hardwood I had been splitting for the fire with a clean authority it had not had since before I found it in the debris. The knife edge came back to a working sharpness that I could feel in the first test cut on my thumb. Small upgrade, but the kind that compounds across every task that uses either tool for as long as I am in this cave. The wolf pups crossed onto the flat rock area for the first time on the 28th day. Not all three at once. Just one. The boldest of them had been pushing further from the gap each morning, and on that morning it came all the way to the edge of the flat rock, while its mother was eating and stood there with its legs slightly splayed, and its ears working every direction at once. I was standing at my usual step-back position, and I did not move. I kept my breathing even and my body still, and let it read me the same way its mother had read me on the first day I came to that boulder formation. The mother finished eating and looked at the pup and looked at me and did not call it back. The pup stood on the flat rock for about 30 seconds and then retreated to the gap on its own. I set the fish on the rock and stepped back the usual distance and turned and walked away. Rook had sat through the whole exchange without a sound beside me, and I put my hand on his back briefly as we walked, and that was the only acknowledgement either of us made of what had just happened. The bow needed attention on the 29th morning. I had been running hard on hunting passes, and the serving on the string had started to show were at the knocking point. I had spare string material in my kit, and I spent the morning reserving the wear section and checking the limbs and the cams for any stress I had missed on previous checks. Everything came back solid. I retuned the draw weight and shot 3 arrows into the ash bank I used as a target backstop, and the grouping was tight and centered, and the sound of the draw and release was clean. I pulled the arrows and put the bow back on its hook on the cave wall, and moved on to the next item on the maintenance list. There was always a next item. That was the nature of the situation, and I had stopped thinking of it as a burden somewhere in the second week. It was just the shape of the days now, and the shape of the days was something I could work with indefinitely. The last few days of the month, the sky continued its slow change. The debris layer overhead was not clearing in any dramatic sense, but the quality of the light coming through it was different from the first week. Less orange, less flat. There were moments in the middle of the day when the light had an almost white quality to it that felt closer to real daylight than anything I had seen since the night the world changed. I did not make too much of it. The atmosphere had taken an enormous amount of material into it, and that material was not going to settle out in a month. What the change told me was that the worst of the immediate debris load had dropped back to the surface, and what remained was the finer particulate that would take much longer to clear. That was livable. That was a sky that would keep getting better rather than worse, and better was the only direction I needed it to go. On what I estimated was the 30th day, I sat at the cave entrance in the early evening and ran a full assessment of the situation the way I had been doing at the end of every week since the start. Food supplied deep enough to sustain me and Rook for months at current consumption, without hunting or fishing at all, though both were continuing and adding to the reserve daily. Water system clean and running without issue. Shelter secure and fully functional. Air circulation solid. Bow maintained and ready. Snare line producing. Fishing rotation producing. Wolf and pup stable and holding weight. Rook healthy and working and sleeping well. The situation was better in every measurable way than it had been on day 1, and better in most ways than it had been on day 7, and that trajectory was the only thing I needed to confirm at the end of any given week. I looked out at the ash field and the black ridge line, and the sky above it that was showing the faint color of whatever the sun was doing behind the debris layer to the west. 30 days into the end of everything, and I was still upright and fed and sheltered and functional. Rook came and sat beside me at the entrance and looked out at the same view I was looking at, and we sat there together until the light when the dark came in, and then I got up and went inside and secured the door and put my hand on my dog in the dark, and we went to sleep inside the only home either of us had left. I had been thinking about the arrow shaft problem, and on the 27th morning, I worked along the base of the ridge looking for fallen timber with the right characteristics. Most of the deadfall was too large or too heat compromised to be useful. But about 300 yards east, I found a smaller diameter trunk that had fallen clean across a rock and stayed off the wet ash. I cut a section and carried it back and split it into blanks and set them near the fire to dry. They would need several weeks before they were stable enough to work, but starting the process now meant having material ready before the need became urgent. I spent time on the 28th afternoon reinforcing the door frame where the stone had settled and loosened in 2 spots. I reset the loose stones and wired the frame corners, and the door seated with a solid sound it had not had before. Everything you build starts degrading the day you finish it, and the gap between what you built and what has become is always smaller than you think if you are not closing it regularly. I ran every system in the cave on a weekly check rotation. Duct joints, fan mounting, water seals, firestone, platform stability, supply organization. None of it took long individually, and all of it together kept the cave running at the level it needed to run at. Deferred maintenance in a survival context is just a future emergency with a delayed fuse. Rook had developed a habit in the evenings of sitting at the cave entrance for about 20 minutes after we ate before coming back inside to sleep I had started sitting with him during that window, not doing anything specific, just sitting at the threshold between the cave and the ash field and letting the day finish itself in the open air before sealing the door for the night. It had become its own kind of routine without either of us deciding to make it one. The ash field in the evening had a particular quality of stillness to it that the daytime did not have, less oppressive somehow. The flat dead light of the day gave way to a dimmer and somehow more honest dark, and the burned ridge line against the sky had a stark clean look to it that I had stopped finding disturbing somewhere in the second week. It was just the landscape now. My landscape, the one I woke up to every morning and worked in every day and came back to every evening, and it was mine in a way that any place becomes yours after enough time and enough work put into it.